Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King, and this is Renaissance Discoveries, in which we look at the inventions, the scholarship, the creativity, and the imagination of some of the brightest sparks in 15th century Italy. In previous videos, we've looked at the discovery or rediscovery of Greek, of classical Latin, and of the vernacular, the language of everyday speech in Italy. In this episode, we look at another language that began receiving attention in the 1400s, one that was long ignored and even despised by many people in the West. However, a number of scholars by the end of the 1400s came to think of it as the language of God himself and as the primal or first language spoken by humans, a language that was the key to understanding both Plato and the Bible, a language that could teach us about human nature, the soul, the creation of the universe, a language that was even believed to possess magical powers. This language was Hebrew, which by 1500, only about 100 people in the West, that is 100 Christians, could read. But critically, one of those Christians who taught himself to read it was Giovanni Pico, the Prince of Mirandola, known as the Prince of Concord, the Prince flawless in knowledge, and the father of the Christian Kabbalah. And in fact, it was the Kabbalah that most interested Pico, these Jewish mystical writings that Pico was the first Christian to study, and that he believed he could absorb into an all-encompassing view of the world and its philosophies and religions. Studying and learning Hebrew would thereafter become one of the preoccupations of the men who created what we call the Renaissance. We're going to take one of our journeys through space, time, and the human mind, from Moses through Plato to 12th century Spain and Provence, and finally to 15th century Italy, where we find Giovanni Pico, this brilliant figure who unites everything, or at least he gives it his best shot. Pico was born in February 1463 in the family castle in Mirandola, some 40 miles north of Bologna. His family had ruled Mirandola since the early 1300s. Giovanni was the youngest of three sons of the ruler of Mirandola, who died when Giovanni was only 4 years old. One of his father's titles had been Count of Concordia, an apt title given that Giovanni's project would be to find concord and harmony between and among all philosophies and religions. It was lucky for Giovanni that he was the youngest son, because it meant he could devote himself to his studies rather than to the tedious business of ruling the tiny princedom. And what a student he was. He began studying law in Bologna when he was 14 years old, and then went on to study at 3 other universities by the time he was 18. He had what one historian has called an omnivorous curiosity, and he clearly had some sort of photographic memory. Legend has it that he could recite the entirety of the Divine Comedy by heart, all 14,233 lines of it. And when he finished, he could then supposedly recite it backwards, something he could apparently do as a party trick with any poem you gave him. He took as his personal symbol a chameleon because he believed that humans were chameleons who could transform themselves. They were able to ascend to heaven and dwell with the angels, but they could also plunge into the brutal world of the beasts. On top of all of these intellectual achievements, Pico had these dreamy good looks. This is a reconstruction of what he supposedly looked like, a real Renaissance pin-up boy. In the course of his studies in places such as Padua and Florence, Pico met a number of Jewish scholars and teachers, such as Elijah del Medico, Johann Alemanno, and a man calling himself Flavius Mithridates, a Jewish convert to Christianity who originally came from Sicily. These scholars introduced young Pico to the Kabbalah, texts in which he believed he could see the outlines not only of the truths of Christian thought, but also the philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, and Pythagoras. So Pico actively sought out these manuscripts as well as these Jewish scholars who could teach him both Hebrew and Aramaic, as well as the long and rich tradition of rabbinic literature and scholarship that had developed in Judaism over the previous 1500 years. Pico was not unique in studying Hebrew at this time. Christian scholars occasionally did study it. Giannozzo Manetti, as you'll know, of course, from my video on the Bible, learned Hebrew because he wanted to make a new translation of the Old Testament. But for the most part, the few Christians who learned Hebrew did so with a view to refuting the Jews and then converting them to Christianity. In fact, in 1434, a council of the church encouraged Christians to study Hebrew in order to combat Jewish heresy. In other words, you would learn Hebrew in order to take on and vanquish the Jews on their home territory. So Christian scholars had no interest in the Hebrew language or literature for its own sake, beyond using it for Christian purposes. Because, let's face it, the Christian West in the Middle Ages and Renaissance was profoundly, vehemently, and sometimes murderously anti-Semitic. Let's look at the situation of the Jews in the West by Pico's time at the end of the 1400s. Judaism was very much a minority religion in Europe. One historian puts the Jewish population on the Italian peninsula during the 1400s at about 30,000 out of a total population of 8 to 10 million. In other words, about 1/3 of 1% of the population. This was far less than there had been in Spain, where in 1400 there were about 400,000 Jews. But then, of course, by 1500, Spain had exactly none because the Jews were expelled in 1492. And they'd already been expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, and they would be expelled from Sicily in 1493, from Lithuania in 1495, and from Portugal in 1497. The reasons for this ugly anti-Semitism were both religious and what we might call socio-economic. The religious objection for Christians was that the Jews did not recognize Christ as the Messiah. It's important to note that Christians and Jews share the same sacred books, the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. But Christians maintained that the Jewish understanding of the Old Testament was wrong. The Jews misread it because they failed to understand that the truths of the Old Testament were actually revealed in the New Testament, which is not a sacred text in Judaism. So we have two competing readings of the books of the Bible. Jewish interpretations of and commentaries on the Bible were therefore regarded by Christians as dangerous, even blasphemous and heretical, and hence such things as the burning of Jewish books in Paris in 1242 and 300 years later in Rome in 1553. There are also social and economic explanations for the brutal anti-Semitism. The relation between Jews and Christians was a complex one. The Jews in Europe were what the political and ecclesiastical leaders might have called a necessary evil. Evil because they were Jewish, but necessary because they provided financial services that Christians, at least in theory, could not offer, those of lending money at interest. A Duke of Milan once said, "The Jewish nation is tolerated by the Most Holy Church and by Christian potentates and allowed to reside in their cities." Well, as we've seen, not all of them, especially following the expulsions around Europe in the 1490s, allowed to reside in their cities in order to protect Christians from the occasion of sin in the form of usurious depravity. In other words, the sin of charging interest on loans. Because in Luke 6:35, Christ says, "Do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return." In other words, don't charge 20% interest on your loan. As well as, the Duke wrote, to provide assistance to their poor and needful subjects. The words poor and needful are important to note. For the most part, the Jewish community lent money not to wealthy Christians, because princes and businessmen could go to Christian bankers such as the Medici, who found ingenious ways to excuse themselves from the sin of usurious depravity. Instead, the Jews loaned to the poor and needful, and many Italian towns featured Jewish moneylenders and pawnbrokers who catered for the credit needs of the lower classes, and by whom the lower classes sometimes felt victimized, leading to such things as blood libels, bogus claims of ritualistic murder, and so forth, which often led then to attacks, massacres, and expulsions. Now, Italy in general and Florence in particular have often been seen by historians as the best places in Europe for Jews in the 1400s. By the standards of the age, writes Jean Brucker, Florence was a remarkably tolerant community. Similarly, Frank Salter, speaking broadly, the Jews in Florence were treated fairly and even leniently. Or Cecil Roth, in no part of the world did such a feeling of friendliness prevail. Certainly, the Medici protected the Jews in Florence, although they made sure they couldn't threaten the financial interests of large-scale bankers such as themselves. In any case, it is largely true that Jews in Italy were, at least nominally, protected by the legal system, albeit they were also restricted by it, restricted in their movements, the length of their stays in various cities, and in what jobs they could take. However, whatever these protections, the appraisals by Brucker and others are probably a bit too optimistic. Anti-Semitism was pretty entrenched in Christian society, and a law enacted in Florence in 1406 stated that Jews or Hebrews are enemies of the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ and of all Christians. Also, throughout the 1400s, we get various rabble-rousing friars coming to cities such as Florence and turning the masses against the Jews with their preaching. The Franciscan Bernardino of Siena said, "The Jews are leeches who ask for nothing better than the opportunity to devour an ailing member whose blood they suck with insatiable ardor." And he was preaching in front of hundreds, even thousands of people in the piazzas. In 1488, a sermon in Florence by another Franciscan ended with an anti-Semitic riot in which a Jewish man was murdered. And in 1493, also in Florence, a Jew was killed by an angry mob after he was accused of desecrating statues. This then is the sort of violent and virulent anti-Semitism that was the backdrop for Pico's exploration of Jewish thought. While many of his fellow Christians either slavered for Jewish blood or denounced Judaism for its theological errors, Pico decided that he wanted to learn Hebrew and study Judaic literature, not to convert the Jews to Christianity, although he probably wouldn't have objected to that, but rather to expound a new and more encompassing view of philosophy and religion that included Judaism. As we'll see, Pico didn't rise above all the prejudices of his time in a way that we today, more than 500 years later, might have hoped he would. But he marks a more tolerant attitude in his ambition to incorporate Jewish insights into his philosophy, in which he tried to bring the religions of the world together, to show their harmonies and connections, and he believed that Kabbalah would help him do just that. But of course, a Christian studying mystical Hebrew writings and applying their lessons to the Bible, as Pico would do, was bound to be controversial and potentially fraught with problems. Learning Hebrew in order to study the Old Testament, to deepen Christian knowledge of the Bible and vanquish the Jews, was one thing, but paying close and careful attention to the writings of Meshuggah French and Spanish rabbis, that was something else entirely. So what exactly was Pico reading? Kabbalah emerged as a kind of mystical literature during the 11 and 1200s in southern France and northern Spain, among groups of rabbis, scholars, and philosophers such as Isaac the Blind and Abraham Abulafia. The word Kabbalah, or Kabbalah, means reception or receipt, and it refers to the reception of traditional wisdom, secret wisdom that was received only by a select and privileged few. The concept of secret or hidden wisdom had long been a part of Judaism. In a part of the book of Ezra not included by St. Jerome in his Latin translation of the Bible, done around 400 AD, we learn how God told the prophet Ezra, I revealed myself in a bush and spoke to Moses, and I told him many wondrous things, and showed him the secrets of the times, and declared to him the end of times. Then I commanded him, saying, these words you shall publish openly, and these you shall keep secret. Or at least these words were kept secret from the masses, from ordinary people, but were transmitted orally as the oral law by and through more exalted and privileged members of the community. The prophet Ezra next tells us that he himself went through the same experience of both revealing and concealing. God sent him into the wilderness with 5 scribes for 40 days and, as God carefully stipulated, lots of writing material. As it turned out, enough for 94 books. At the end of this marathon of copying, Ezra writes, the Most High spoke to me, saying, make public the 24 books that you wrote first, and let the worthy and the unworthy read them. But keep the 70 that were written last in order to give them to the wise among your people. The 24 books were the Hebrew Bible, the books of the Old Testament, which were available to all, while the 70 books, as Pico came to understand it, contained the wisdom of the Kabbalah, revelations and religious doctrines that had been entrusted only to the few who had the proper wisdom and understanding, and who passed it down through the generations and centuries. Now, let's fast forward from the book of Ezra to Provence in southern France in the 1100s, where a Jewish hermit and mystic named Jacob Nazir, aka Jacob ben Saul, receives revelations from the prophet Elijah. Jacob transmits these revelations to his friend and fellow mystic, Abraham ben David Maimuni, who in turn initiates his son, Isaac ben Abraham, aka Isaac the Blind, who a rabbi in Spain will later call the father of the Kabbalah. So what develops in France and Spain in these decades around the year 1200 are circles of Jewish scholars and mystics writing commentaries and essays on the Torah and rabbinic law. Texts with such resonant names as Sefer ha-Bahir, or Book of Brilliance, and this is the big one, the Zohar, which means splendor or radiance. This latter work first appeared in Spain in the 13th century, but supposedly it was written more than 1,000 years earlier by a cave-dwelling, miracle-working wise man in Judea named Shimon bar Yochai. More probably, the Zohar was written, we might say forged, or at least compiled, by a Spanish rabbi named Moses de León. He seems to have composed it in a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic to make it seem much older than it probably was. The Zohar and other Kabbalistic works became influential in Judaism in the centuries that followed, one of its many intellectual currents. But the Christian response for some 300 years was basically silence. No Christian scholars, even the few who could read Hebrew, appear to have read, paid any attention to, or even been aware of the Kabbalistic writings. But then, finally, Pico will arrive on the scene. So why should Pico have been interested in these Jewish mystical writings? A key figure for the Western reception of Hebrew writings in general, and the Kabbalah in particular, was Plato, a philosopher who was only rediscovered and read in the West in the 1400s. See, of course, a certain video on the subject. Did you know that Plato was Jewish, or at least that he studied with ancient Hebrew teachers? By the second half of the 15th century, a number of Jewish scholars in Italy revived an old idea that Plato had studied under Hebrew sages, and that there were therefore strong links between his thought and that of Judaism. These ideas stretch back many centuries. A pagan philosopher named Numenius, working in what's now Syria in the 2nd century AD, famously said that Plato was nothing but Moses speaking Greek. Numenius believed that the soul of Moses had transmigrated into Plato's body because of Plato's great love and respect for the Torah. Another tradition held that Plato got his wisdom from someone else, the prophet Jeremiah. The pair of them met, so the story went, in Egypt, to which Plato had come to study and to which Jeremiah had fled after the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. This story was upheld by a Christian scholar, St. Ambrose, in the 4th century AD. St. Augustine then poured some cold water on it, pointing out that the chronology was a bit inconvenient because Plato lived 100 years after Jeremiah. But connections between Plato and Judaism were put forward by other early Christian writers, such as Eusebius, who wrote that Plato followed the all-wise Moses and the Hebrew prophets. The strongest proponent of this belief may have been Justin Martyr, a Christian philosopher from the 2nd century AD. He accused Plato of plagiarism. Yes, Plato apparently peeked over Moses' shoulder during the final exam and ripped off his answers. And I add as a footnote the fact that some Jewish scholars even held that Plato's pupil Aristotle actually converted to Judaism. So, whatever the truth of these stories, what we have developing in the early centuries of Christianity, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries AD, is the idea that Moses, the founding figure of Judaism, comes together with Plato, the father of Greek philosophy, and specifically the idea that the former influenced the latter, and that there were therefore compatibilities between the Jewish religion and pagan philosophy. Now, if for many centuries in the West, Judaism and Platonism were both either despised and ignored, or else completely unknown, by the 1400s, the attitude towards Plato, at least, began to change. Again, please watch my Plato video for more information. But in a nutshell, the complete works of Plato came to the West for the first time in the 1400s, specifically to Florence, where scholars such as Marsilio Ficino tried to reconcile them with Christianity, to show that many Christian insights could be found in Plato's philosophy, which served as a kind of precursor to Christian thought. The possible link between Plato and Judaism made scholars in Italy sit up and take note. The scholars of the 1400s wanted to get back to original sources, to trace wisdom back to its earliest manifestations. Their sudden and renewed interest in Plato therefore motivated some of them to look at his sources, at who influenced him. And when they came to believe that he studied under an ancient Egyptian sage named Hermes Trismegistus, they eagerly translated and read the Hermetic texts, occult, mystical works that they believed had fed Plato's intellect and imagination. Whereas, spoiler alert, they were actually written many centuries after Plato's death. I humbly and modestly bring to your attention my companion video on the Hermetic texts. Likewise, since legend held that Plato studied with Hebrew sages, certain scholars, Pico foremost among them, suddenly became interested in Judaism. What could Judaism teach us about Plato? And what could these links between Plato and Judaism tell us about their links to Christianity and about all world religions? Would it be possible to compile a kind of universal wisdom that encompassed Christianity, Judaism, and Greek philosophy? All of this was, to put it mildly, exciting stuff. Something really interesting happens when Pico studies the Kabbalah in the 1480s. Pennies start dropping. He claims that when he reads the Kabbalistic books, I saw in them a religion, and here God is my witness, that was exceedingly Christian. And in those matters which pertain to philosophy, one may really hear Pythagoras and Plato, whose doctrines are so akin to our Christian faith. So, Plato, Pythagoras, Jewish mysticism, Christianity, all of these things start coming together for Pico as he sees the connections between them. So Pico decides to spread the news. In the autumn of 1486, when he's 23, he composes a series of 900 propositions, his famous 900 Theses. These draw together the wisdom of Christian scholars and writers, of Plato and Aristotle, but also of Arabic philosophers, as well as, naturally, the Kabbalah, all of which he believed, and this is the critical point, were basically saying the same thing. Beneath the apparent differences of terminology and methodology, all of these philosophies and religions were, he believed, broadly in agreement. So, the Christians, the Jews, the Greeks, the Muslims, even ancient magicians such as Hermes Trismegistus were all offshoots of the same broad tree trunk of the old-time religion. It was a multicultural model of religious and philosophical systems. Pico published his 900 Theses as Conclusiones Philosophicae, Kabbalisticae et Theologicae, philosophical, Kabbalistical, and theological conclusions, a work that was full of references to the Kabbalah. Pico then proposed to go to Rome in early 1487 to debate his theses with all comers, or as he put it, with any philosopher or theologian, even from the ends of Italy. And he generously promised to pay the travel expenses out of his own pocket. It would have been a great debate, the dazzling young Pico parrying thrusts from egg-headed professors and fusty old Vatican theologians by quoting from Jewish and Arabic sources. But it was not to be. Pope Innocent VIII quickly banned the debate, and Pico's book was investigated by a commission of theologians who a few months later, in March 1487, declared that 7 of his points were heretical and another 6 a bit iffy. Things then only got worse in the weeks that followed. Pico wrote a defense of his position, the Inquisition was summoned, the entire book was declared heretical, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. He hightailed it for France, but was caught and arrested in early 1488, although he was eventually released thanks to the good offices of his 2 most powerful supporters, the King of France, Charles VIII, and Lorenzo de' Medici. But the debate never took place and the book was suppressed, and with it, the chance of a cross-cultural exchange that would have been many centuries ahead of its time. Now, I said that Pico does not quite live up to our standards of enlightened toleration, because he appears to have believed that if all religions were equal, one of them, Christianity, was more equal than the others. In his defense to the Pope, he claimed that his purpose in studying the Kabbalah was to do battle for the faith against the relentless slanders of the Hebrews. In other words, to do what all other Christian scholars of Hebrew had tried to do, to show the Jews the error of their ways. It's difficult to know how much of this was sincere on Pico's part and how much simply lip service intended to appease the Pope and the Inquisition. Sadly, Pico died young in 1494 at the age of 31. According to a study published in 2018, following scientific examination of his remains, he died from arsenic poisoning. Although the authors of the study point out that it's difficult to know if it was a deliberate murder, which rumor has long conjectured, or simply contamination through environmental exposure or medical procedures. Pico may have died, but the Kabbalah would live on, not just in Jewish, but also now in Christian culture, in the form of the thinkers now known as the Christian Kabbalists. These were men such as one of Pico's followers, the German scholar Johann Reuchlin, who continued the tradition of exploring and incorporating the wisdom of the rabbis. Historians today are only just beginning to explore how, over the following decades and centuries, Christian interpretations of esoteric Jewish doctrines were integrated into and influenced Western ideas about language, philosophy, natural science, alchemy, and astrology. The Christian Kabbalists were not some crazy offshoot on the margins of intellectual culture, but rather, historians now realize, one of the most important traditions in European thought. Many of these scholars were particularly taken by one aspect of the Kabbalah that was practiced by men such as Abraham Abulafia and taught to Pico by his Jewish friends. If Hebrew was the original divine language, the language through which God created heaven and earth, then it had magical powers and inexhaustible meanings. Pico therefore came to believe that the meaning of a sacred text could be understood through a series of hidden signs and symbols on the page, such things as combinations and permutations of letters. He thought secret meanings revealed themselves through the ars combinandi, or art of combination, a kind of word game in which every conceivable coupling and interchange of letters was explored for its deep and hidden meaning. Pico gives an example of such secrets through an examination of the opening of the Hebrew Bible. Bereshit, in the beginning. Pico begins picking the word apart and putting the letters into various combinations. He writes, among the Hebrews, this phrase is written thus, Bereshit. From this, if we join the third letter to the first, comes the word ab. If we add the second to the doubled first, we get bibar. If we read all except the first, we get reshit. If we connect the fourth to the last, we get Shabbat. And so on, and on and on, in what Umberto Eco has called a series of death-defying transformations and anagrams. Once Pico has unpicked all of these subtle hidden clues, he puts everything together and finds the secret message. The Father, in the Son, and through the Son, the beginning and end or rest, created the head, the fire, and the foundation of the great man with a good pact. All of that comes out of the single word, Bereshit. This is great fun, obviously. I'm not sure about Pico as a theologian, but let's face it, he would have been a formidable opponent in Scrabble. It was this bizarre kind of word search that would go on to have a legacy, not so much in biblical interpretation, but in magic and alchemy. But that is, of course, another story. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. Please watch my other videos. And for more information on the world-changing scholars of the 15th century, please, as Pico might say, effleuresse, look nobler, available in your favorite bookshop.